great RPGs of the past, there's so many, it's hard to even list them all, but I mean, there's a whole bunch that come to mind for me. One of the first RPGs I ever played was a great game called Wizardry, Proving Grounds of the Mad Overlord, back on the Apple II. It was like, I don't know, 1980 or something like that. And I loved it because of the possibility space, and it just made you really imagine what the world was like, and a lot of it was in your head, but you know, the story was implied by as much by some of the fragments of dialogue you saw, or by the actions of your characters and party, or even just imagining as you travel around this dungeon what would be going on. Wasteland, and then Fallout was sort of the spiritual successor to that game. I loved the original Fallout. You know, Fallout 3 kind of built on that heritage of Fallout 1 and 2 and Wasteland before that. And those are great games. System Shock, the original System Shock, like 94 or 95, I think, that was one of my favorite RPGs. It was one of the first 3D games, too. The Ultima Underworld engine was built on that. And System Shock, you know, great game. BioShock was the spiritual successor to that game, I think, along with System Shock 2. You know, I played all these games back in the 80s and 90s. A lot of Japanese RPGs as well. The Final Fantasy series. Final Fantasy VII is one of my favorites from Square Enix. And I love RPGs. I think there's an evolution of all games towards a more sort of transparent interface and smoother approach to storytelling and better characterization. And you know, what our BioWare's vision is really genuine emotional engagement. We want players to really feel something when they play our games, so that can be done in a variety of ways. But you know, part of it is just removing the barriers to entry, the user interface, making it really easy to play and accessible, but not losing any of the depth and richness of the gameplay that people really love about RPGs. Well, I think it's great to contemplate building a trilogy like we're doing in Mass Effect and allow players to feel like there's continuity between the games and to really feel like they get to continue what they started in the first game or the second game or beyond. I see the definition of RPG continuing to broaden, and in many ways other game genres continuing to, as you say, evolve to capture some of the features of RPGs. You look at Grand Theft Auto as a series, there's a lot of RPG elements there, progression customization and story elements and quests and kind of like taking on these things, but a lot of it's presentation, you know, how explicitly you call it an RPG versus just saying, hey, we're just going to make a great game that's really fun, that has choice, that matters, that has exploration, progression customization, character development and growth, combat, you know, those are the elements of RPGs. And story and narrative is one of them as well. But you can have a lot of different types of narrative, and I think gameplay-driven narrative can include story, it can include the moment-to-moment combat, the ballet of combat, exploration, the narrative of an adventurer, narrative of a progression, customization of your character. It can be all these different things. I think that's one of the things we're striving for, is to enable players to make different choices, and it's not always clear what's the right choice, but to make them all interesting, fun choices. You know, so there's no good or bad choice. There's no, you know, you're mechanistically getting more points on a curve to just get rewards arbitrarily, but instead making you feel like there's consequences to your actions that are going to be fun and cool to explore, sometimes with rewards, sometimes with penalties, sometimes with both. You know, just considering one element of how the expression of your choices is manifested, like choice and consequence through the reactions of your party team, your non-player characters that you get to bring alongside you and become player characters, essentially. There's a whole bunch of them, right? So they all have different opinions, they all can like or dislike your actions, so every choice you make, some of them might like it, some of them might dislike it, but it might not be the same ones each time, so lots of permutations and combinations that are pretty cool to explore. It's interesting talking through that because you identified two major buckets of story. You know, I think there's another category of story as well that's narrative. It's driven by gameplay. So maybe you consider that as a superset of all types of story, whether it's combat-derived, exploration, progression, or story. But focusing on the story part of it, there can be an authored experience or there can be an open-world emergent experience. Within an authored experience, you can in turn break it down into more categories, non-linear or linear fiction or a mixture of both. Within that, you can actually have third-person or first-person type narrative. Mass Effect is an example maybe of a third-person authored experience with some non-linear, a lot of non-linearity, obviously, but you know, a little bit of open world, but more of an authored experience. But it's a third-person experience in the sense that you're conveying a suggestion to Shepard, who has a defined personality, and then you see what Shepard does, and it's really cool to see that. It's almost a mini game of sorts every time you have a conversation, and it's fun. And Dragon Age is more of a first-person authored experience where you are that character. Right from the moment of the origin story, you're invested as a character, you take the role on, you really feel like it's you that's making those choices. So we focus on the responses of the non-player characters to you, and that's the difference in our mind between a first-person and third-person authored experience. But there's lots of ways to tell a good story, and I think they're all really cool. what I meant by first-person narrative is it's more of an I am that character, and you're unfolding, making choices in real time as the character in the world. Whereas the third person, it's more you're observing a character, you are that character, so it's sort of second person maybe in that sense, but you're also watching the character and you're seeing what happens when you issue orders to that character, and sort of not totally clear every time what you do. When you do an interrupt, for example, with Shepard in Mass Effect 2, it's sort of Shepard raw emotion just flowing out. What's going to happen? It's crazy, right? But it'll be fun either way. So I think those are both valid expressions of storytelling, and they're both really fun to play through, but they're just different varieties of authored experiences. I see video games as an art form. I see them as a commercial art form, but an art form nonetheless. And I think it's amazing how video games continue to progress. I think in the last 30 years, we've kind of built the camera on which we're telling stories, and the next 30 years are going to be even better. I think the best stuff is still ahead of us because we're now perfecting the craft of storytelling and narrative and gameplay and just like emergent fun that, it's so cool to be around a show like Gamescom because there's so much cool stuff going on. Everybody's got different ways to do things, and you can learn so much as a game developer and creator by looking at what's going on in the world. And I think the best work in video games is still ahead of us.